This 1971, a protest stage, flags waving, crowds chanting, and Joan Baez frozen backstage, refusing to walk out, not because of fear, not because of politics, because someone was on the lineup, someone she couldn't stand. To the world, Joan Baez was calm, poised, untouchable, the queen of protest folk, but under that graceful image lived a storm of betrayals, silences, and wounds that never quite healed. Now, after years of quiet, she names them: 5 artists, 5 scars, and every name unlocks a door she once kept sealed. The first name she dared to speak aloud, the one who shattered her heart, and then rewrote the song book of history as if she had never been part of the chorus. The man who lit the match, Bob Dylan. It started with love and ended with silence sharper than any lyric. In the early 16th, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez weren't just the darlings of folk, they were the heartbeat of a movement, protest partners, musical soulmates. She opened doors for him, pulled him onto stages, and lent him her audience when few knew his name. She believed in his poetry like scripture, but as Dylan's fame exploded, something shifted. The man who once whispered verses in her ear began to vanish behind dark sunglasses and closed hotel doors. By 1965 he stopped calling, stopped caring. He booked an entire world tour and left her name off the bill, no explanation, no warning, just absence. Then came the Newport folk guitar and shocked the folk world, but for Joan the real shock was what he unplugged: their bond. He dismissed her politics, mocked her causes. Her heart broke in silence as she watched the boy she once knew become a myth before her eyes. Years later he'd toss off jokes in interviews as if their history were just a quirky footnote. She never laughed because to her, Dylan wasn't just a lost lover, he was a monument to betrayal. He became proof that even revolutionaries could sell out, that even poets could turn cold. And that wound, it didn't just hurt, it echoed like a verse left unfinished. But Dylan wasn't the only man who twisted friendship into something darker. Another voice from Laurel Canyon would leave a bitter taste in her mouth, one that no harmony could hide. The next name, a man whose harmony soared but whose ego hit even harder. His voice was velvet, his politics loud, but behind the peace signs hid a razor-sharp tongue. Well, first of all, let us be righteously cynical about the music industry and the people who make money in it. Basically, their job is making money. So when somebody said to me, "Well, Joan, you think you haven't had an album in the last 6 years 'cause your politics?" He didn't shout over her, he cut beneath her. The one she couldn't ignore, David Crosby. He was loud, arrogant, and painfully self-righteous, wrapped in velvet harmonies. Joan first met David Crosby in the hazy circles of Laurel Canyon in the late 16th. At first, his quick wit and fearless opinions intrigued her. He was bold, brash, and unapologetically loud. But that charm, she soon discovered, came with a sharper edge. Beneath the laid-back vibe and signature mustache was a man who took pleasure in needling others, especially women who stood their ground. At a televised anti-war event in 1970, Crosby crossed the line. As Baez waited to perform a protest song dedicated to political prisoners, Crosby veered off script and turned to the cameras with a crooked smile and a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He called her out as being more performance than principle. The insult rang out across millions of televisions. She kept her composure, finishing her set with quiet fury, but later that night she wept, not out of weakness but out of a white-hot anger. Crosby, glassy-eyed and inflated by fame, had reduced her convictions to theatrics. To Joan, he became the embodiment of a dangerous kind of hypocrisy, a man who wrapped himself in peace signs but wielded his ego like a weapon. While she marched, fasted, and got arrested, Crosby criticized from comfortable stages, soaking in applause. This feud never turned explosive, but it turned everything cold. She turned down interviews, panels, even recording sessions if Crosby's name was attached, not because she feared confrontation, but because she no longer had patience for hollow activism dressed as rebellion. But not every betrayal came from a microphone or a melody. Some came from the very front lines of revolution, wrapped in slogans, fire, and fury. And the next man, he wasn't just loud. He turned her beliefs into a punchline. The next name Joan couldn't forgive, Jerry Rubin. He wasn't a musician, But in the late 60s, his voice roared louder than electric guitars, shaking the rafters of protests and press rooms alike. Jerry Rubin was a revolutionary, a firebrand, a headline hunter. He marched through campuses and microphones with fists raised and slogans sharpened like knives. Baez admired his drive at first. He was bold, visionary, maybe even a little dangerous. And she liked that, but revolution, she would learn, comes in many shades, and Rubin's was soaked in ego. In 1969, during a major anti-war rally in Chicago, Joan stood backstage tuning her guitar, her song prepared to echo through a restless crowd. It was a moment for unity, but Rubin took the mic first and ripped the harmony to pieces. With a smirk and a cigarette, he launched into a tirade. Without naming her, he spat venom at peace-loving performers who sing songs while real rebels spill blood. And then louder, she was a folk singer hiding behind guitars while real people take to the streets. The laughter that followed was thunderous, but to Joan it sounded like betrayal. Her fingers stiffened on the strings, her breath caught. In front of thousands, the very man she thought was a comrade had turned her beliefs into a joke. He'd thrown compassion under the wheels of revolution just to steal the spotlight. She performed anyway, calm, poised, unshaken. But when the lights dimmed, she made a decision that would last a lifetime. From that day forward, she never shared a stage with him again. Not out of fear, but out of principle. Because to Baez, courage without kindness wasn't revolution. It was cruelty in a clever disguise. To Baez, there was no cause noble enough to excuse cruelty. But betrayals didn't end on stage or in protests. Some of the deepest cuts came in the studio, where trust was tested not with words but with silence, control, and condescension. The next name on her list, Paul Simon. Brilliant, cold, dismissive, and unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Joan Baez and Paul Simon attempted a studio collaboration in 1978. What was supposed to be a powerful meeting of two legends dissolved within hours. From the very first take, Simon controlled the room like a conductor without patience. He interrupted Joan mid-note, corrected her phrasing with clipped precision, and worst of all, suggested she change the lyrics to a song she had written after a personal loss. The air in the studio thickened. She clenched her jaw, tried to hold her ground. But every suggestion from her was met with a sigh, an eye roll, or a passive-aggressive smile. By the third song, it wasn't music, it was war in whispers. She walked out, head high, voice trembling. He didn't stop her. He didn't say a word. For someone who had sung beside civil rights leaders and stood up to political giants, being made to feel small by a fellow artist was something she never expected. Years later, she confided in a friend. "I've shared stages with murderers of conscience, but Paul Simon was the one that made me feel invisible." Their paths rarely crossed again, and when they did, she made sure it was only in passing. To Baez, Simon embodied a specific kind of cold brilliance, the kind that builds walls instead of bridges. But perhaps the most chilling silence of all came not from a man, but from another woman. A fellow icon. A peer who stood just close enough to be a mirror and just far enough to become a rival. The name, Joni Mitchell. Two women, two guitars, two icons, and between them, an invisible wall no melody could breach. To the public, they were destined to be comrades, queens of folk, sisters in protest. But the reality was frostbitten from the very beginning. Their first backstage encounter in 1968 was a quiet disaster. Joni extended a warm hand, and Joan met it with a cold nod, barely looking up from her drink. Mitchell once dismissed Baez's voice as churchy, claiming it lacked soul. Baez didn't flinch in public, but the wound was deep. In her private journal, she described Joni as frost in a silk dress, graceful but glacial. What followed wasn't explosive, it was icier, more haunting. And the war held a weight that moved slowly, like fog creeping across the stage. They declined each other's invitations, silently withdrew from tributes, smiled when cameras flashed, then turned away as soon as the shutters clicked. It wasn't hatred, it was mutual erasure. For fans, it was agony, two voices that shaped a generation forever kept apart by an invisible feud. For Baez, it became a boundary she refused to cross again. She respected Joni's mind, envied her songwriting, yes, but she could never stomach the condescension that trailed behind her every word like expensive perfume. Their feud became folklore, unspoken, unresolved, and painfully real. These 5 names may never appear in her set lists, but they shape the woman behind the legend. Joan Baez has never been one to scream. She never needed to. Her silence always said more than 1,000 headlines. When she finally chose to name the names, the ones that haunted, hurt, or humiliated her, it wasn't revenge. It wasn't spectacle. It was a long-awaited exhale. She didn't burn bridges, she simply stopped pretending they were still standing. No press releases, no Twitter storms, just a quiet shift in her eyes, a refusal to sing the same duets, and a subtle deletion from her story. Some artists settle scores with guitars. Joan settled hers with grace. But grace doesn't mean forgetting. And in that quiet defiance, in the poise that dared to hold pain, she remains what she always was, unshaken, unbending, and unmistakably Joan.